Welcome back to the RIOT ACT. My name is Rishi Rajagopalan, and today I want to talk about the only profession where domestic violence is a part of the job description. No, I'm not talking about police officers. Our topic today is mixed martial arts and the UFC. Now you might be asking yourself, what is the UFC? If that's the case, congrats on not taking horse medicine. As the rest of us in the Joe Rogan Discord know, the Ultimate Fighting Championship is a cage fighting mixed martial arts league where competitors attempt to defeat their opponents and prove they're the best fighter. It's like American Idol for high school bullies, and instead of singing, they try to kill people. And exactly like American Idol, UFC owes its rise to one roided up Chris Daughtry, Dana White. Roughly 20 years ago, the UFC was in the same place Facebook was, around but only for people who just got dumped and couldn't afford therapy. In 1996, Senator and sleep apnea pro subscriber John McCain actually tried to get MMA-style fighting banned and labeled illegal.
There was people knocking them other down, sitting on top of them and smashing them in the face. There was no referee, there was nothing. It was terrible. What it was at the beginning was human cockfighting. It was.
When did Lindsey Graham teach Senator Apnea about cockfighting? The early iterations of the UFC were absolute chaos. The sport began without any weight classes for fighters, no time limits or referees, and all fights needed to be finished by knockout. Look how people viewed the sport back then.
Tensions, they do run high on both sides of the issue. Supporters say, hey, it's an economic boom. We've seen it across the country and it's exploded in popularity. It's happening underground. Why not regulate it? Opponents, like Senator John McCain, who once famously called it human cockfighting, say the thing is barbaric.
They were talking about the UFC like a dare ad. But unlike drugs, which are fun, the UFC was actually dangerous. It was getting banned across the country and didn't garner much public attention. As of 2001, the sport was only generating 55,000 viewers a year. That's equivalent to a single Roswell, New Mexico, minus the aliens. But then, in 2001, Dana White and billionaire businessman Tillman and Lorenzo Fertitta purchased the UFC for just $2.1 million. If their names sound familiar to you, it's not because the Fertitta bros created the crustless quiche. Tillman now owns the equally failing Houston Rockets.
Hey Rockets fans, it's time for the mechanical bull can. Time to cowboy up and hold on tight. Let's ride.
These Cowboys, much like their counterparts in Dallas, stink. While the Fertitta bros were the money behind the new UFC, Dana White was the brains, believe it or not. Under White's regime, the UFC cleaned up. The sport established a set of rules and penalties, added referees, time limits, and a point-based scoring system. These reforms limited the barbarism that made it so unpopular. As a result, the UFC was allowed on pay-per-view and spawned a popular reality TV series, The Ultimate Fighter.
Which one of you will have your picture up in here? Good luck, gentlemen.
So it's basically 16 guys, 2 different weight classes, live in a house, get split up into 2 different teams with 2 different coaches. And at the end of the season, you'd end up with 2 different guys in 2 different weight classes that would win and become the Ultimate Fighter. Then the coaches would fight on pay-per-view.
This HGH-fueled Hunger Games ended up getting some attention, and the UFC kept growing in popularity. In fact, as of 2020, despite being entirely aired on pay-per-view, the UFC was averaging over 830,000 viewers per fight.
Alhamdulillah, God gave me everything. Alhamdulillah.
With a $75 pay-per-view every month, you'd think these athletes are making money hand over fist. But like Dana White claiming he doesn't do cocaine, that's just not true. 48% of UFC fighters make less than the average household income in the United States. The lowest earners made less than $10,000 last year. Can you imagine any other sport where professional athletes are on the edge of the poverty line? If the revenue the UFC is raking in via pay-per-view and sponsorship is being fairly distributed to the fighters, this shouldn't be happening. But the UFC is not like other leagues, and not just because humping is a winning strategy. In most other major sports leagues, players receive around half of the revenue generated by ticket sales, TV contracts, merchandising, and sponsorships. In the UFC, that number floats around 16%. They get 3 times less of the overall revenue share that athletes in the NFL, NBA, NHL, and MLB get. It's driven major stars in the sport, like Jorge Masvidal, to speak out.
Basically, it's not that I'm asking for more money. It's I'm asking for a bigger revenue share of what we bring in.
I at least spent, I had to be about 98% at least. So maybe I walked away with a little bit, but I have 200,000. Yeah, I'm just lucky I made a bonus. to be honest.
Since you've been down at middleweight, you've been almost unbeatable. Do you anticipate fighting again or kind of waiting to see what happens in that title fight?
I'm broke, so I need to fight.
The main reason these fighters have been unable to increase their revenue share is the lack of a union. Not only does the UFC not have a fighters union, their fighters aren't even employees. They're classified as independent contractors. The most terrifying people in the world and your DoorDash driver have the exact same employment status. Remember those sponsorships I was talking about? Well, after the UFC signed a deal with Reebok in 2015, fighters weren't permitted to have any other sponsors for content produced by the UFC. So where did the Reebok money go? Based on the number of fights under their belt, athletes made between $2,500 and $20,000 per event, with title contenders and champions making $30,000 and $40,000 respectively from the brand deal. Ryan Bader, a fighter who left the UFC for rival league Bellator, said the way the UFC structured the Reebok deal severely restricted what sponsorships fighters could get, and he lost $20,000 to $65,000 per fight as a result. Dwayne Johnson's Project Rock just signed an exclusive multi-year sneaker deal with the UFC. Will The Rock and Under Armour disclose what exactly fighters will receive from this? Basically, every major sport has a players' association that lobbies owners and executives for higher pay, better playing conditions, and a variety of other athlete needs and desires. If anything, the UFC needs this the most. I mean, the worst part of every UFC knockout is the 5 seconds the loser gets their face caved in before Herb Dean finally runs over to break it up. Luckily for them, the UFC does offer medical benefits for active fighters that suffer immediate injuries in fights or training camp. But fighters are on their own when it comes to long-term healthcare or a pension plan, things that seem necessary after years of involvement in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. To be fair, UFC President Dana White recently hinted that might be changing soon.
That was on Instagram.
Right.
And
yeah.
I responded to the wrong guy when I said soon. that was wrong, actually. I actually noticed that later, that I had said soon, but it was on the wrong post.
Sorry, kids. Dana misclicked on Instagram, so Daddy's CTE isn't getting treated after all. Roger Goodell or Adam Silver would never be able to dick around like this, because while other sports leagues have commissioners, the UFC has a dictator. Dana White, subject to the biopic Boss Baby, is a one-man show capable of just about anything. As a businessman, he is undeniable, having single-handedly brought MMA to the mainstream. The UFC is projected to net over $1 billion in 2022. But in return, he has autonomy over nearly all of the UFC's decision-making, including fighter pay. And if you're wondering how he feels about this issue, you can hear it directly from the source.
Every time somebody comes out and says, oh, you don't pay your fighters, you don't pay your fighters. I could come out and do this every fuck. I'm not. I don't give a shit. You don't like the way we pay our fighters? Too fucking bad. Go start another MMA organization and you go fucking figure out how to do it.
For Dana, a man whose net worth is north of $500 million, this has nothing to do with equitable pay structures and everything to do with the power and control he holds over these fighters. Take Leslie Smith, for example. After 4 years in the UFC, her contract was terminated despite coming off of 2 wins. Smith alleges that her release was because of her advocacy for a fighters union. She even got Kobe to vouch for it at a UFC event. This was further proof that in the UFC, if a fighter does something that Dana doesn't like, they can be gone in a flash, even if they're the best in the world. Current heavyweight champion Francis Ngannou has been at odds with Dana for months now over his pay.
In the past 2 years, I fought twice, and then I have to borrow money to live. Nobody cares about that. I have no guarantee in that year, and I have no protection. So based on that experience, I want to get something better, a better term on my contract.
Imagine if Tom Brady had to borrow money to make his avocado ice cream, or LeBron couldn't afford to go to Barnes & Noble, pick up a copy of Malcolm X's autobiography. It's truly baffling to think that one of the UFC's best has to borrow money for his training camps. Contrast this with boxing, the other major combat sport, and the difference is staggering. According to reports, heavyweight champions Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury each walked away with over $20 million from their most recent bout. Meanwhile, Ngannou, who just defended his UFC championship 2 weeks ago, received $600,000, and he was the biggest winner. In total, roughly $2 million in purse and bonuses was paid out across all 22 fighters that fought at UFC 270, an event which is estimated to have made around $40 million in pay-per-view sales alone. And for the people who will inevitably bring up that fighters only fight 2 or 3 times a year, let's nip that in the bud. These athletes are training year-round for these fights on their own dime, withstanding long-term injury damage and dangerous weight cuts. And to top it off, they're not in full control of when they get to fight due to pullouts, contractual messes, and UFC scheduling. For all that they endure, these people deserve a higher standard of treatment. So how do we get there? Well, according to former UFC A-listers Tyron Woodley and Ben Askren, the answer is simple. Go toe-to-toe with the biggest, baddest fighter on the planet. Jake Paul?
Get my money, Jake. Get my motherfucking money, Jake. Just step into the...
For Askren and Woodley, the Jake Paul retirement package was the biggest payday they had ever seen. But besides delivering UFC fighters millions in the boxing ring, Jake Disney's thrown some jabs at Dana White too.
You greedy bald bitch. Look at your board. Raise pay-per-view prices and pay fighters less? You're sweating like a pig. It's time to put an end to this shit, Dana.
Dana lacking infrastructure. That bald bitch should have stayed a kickbox instructor. Since Khabib retired, you just cannot recover. You bankrupt. Fertitta's went and pulled you out the dumpster. Fuck Dana. Yeah. Fuck Dana White. Yeah. Fuck Dana. Fuck Dana White. Dana, pay your fighters more. Give them healthcare, you scumbag. I haven't met a single person who says anything good about you. I passed my drug test and you went silent. I'm keeping my foot on your neck until you tap, bitch.
Okay, he definitely didn't write any of those lyrics, but the Triller Troll Doll is making some good points. Upping minimum fight pay, establishing a long-term healthcare program, and increasing revenue shares are all key steps to changing the financial situation for UFC fighters. With Humpty Dumpty Dana at the helm, none of these changes seem likely. But if a fighters union is established, the power can shift to the hands of the people putting their lives on the line in the cage. And that starts with the outfit's biggest stars leading the cause.
Do you have opinions on this in terms of what you think about unionizing fighters?
Maybe in the future. Right now, I've got to focus on myself. That might be selfish, but this is the position I'm in right now. I have a lot going on. I've got to focus on my own self right now.
MAGA Gregor has no vested interest in supporting a union because, unlike most other fighters on the roster, he can do whatever he pleases. Dana may rule with an iron fist, but those rules don't apply to the biggest pay-per-view star in the world, who made $8.6 million per minute of MMA he competed in this past year. Unless the sport's indispensable stars carry the torch for fighter issues, Dana White will keep rear naked choking his fighters' bank accounts. So if anything, we hope this episode has made you more comfortable illegally streaming these fights. But if you really care about these fighters, fight for them outside the octagon. Lord knows their organization isn't. My name is Rishi Rajagopalan, and you've been read the Riot Act.